When a frightened 7-year-old girl rushes into Central City Hospital's emergency room clutching her favorite stuffed rabbit and pleading for help as her grandfather lies unconscious after a violent attack, the staff initially dismiss it as another tragic medical emergency. But as nurse Alex Ramirez listens to Maya's chilling details, he realizes there's something far more sinister at play. Before we dive into this gripping tale, let us know where you're watching from, and if you believe in the power of courage, hit that like button and subscribe for more. The emergency room was alive with activity, a constant symphony of voices, beeping monitors, and hurried footsteps echoing under the harsh fluorescent lights. Alex Ramirez, a seasoned nurse with years of experience, stood at the nurse's station reviewing patient charts. His seasoned eyes took in the sight of a small girl no older than 7 stumbling into the bustling emergency room. Maya clutched a worn stuffed rabbit in one hand, her other arm hanging limply at her side, revealing faint purple bruises along her pale skin. Her dark hair was tangled, and her clothes were smeared with dirt, tears streaking her flushed cheeks. "Help, my grandpa isn't moving," the girl cried, her voice cracking with desperation. Alex immediately dropped his clipboard and hurried toward her, kneeling to meet the child's eye level. "Sweetheart, you're safe now," he said gently but firmly. "What's your name?" "Maya," the girl whispered, her voice barely audible over the chaos of the "Hi Maya, I'm Alex. Can you tell me what happened to your grandpa?" Maya's lips trembled as she tried to explain. "I tried to wake him up, but he wouldn't move. There were loud noises, and I hid under the table." She hugged her stuffed rabbit tighter, her knuckles white against its worn fabric. Alex's chest tightened. "Loud noises? What kind of noises?" Maya shook her head, her voice barely a whisper. "Yelling and things breaking." Alex kept his expression calm despite the alarm bells ringing in his head. He reached for the radio clipped to his uniform. "We need paramedics dispatched immediately to this address," he said, rattling off the location Maya had provided through her sobs. "Potential assault," he noted mentally. Maya flinched at the word assault, but Alex's hand gently touched her shoulder. "Maya, the paramedics are on their way. They're going to take care of your grandpa and bring him here. Can you stay with me and help me make sure he's okay?" Maya nodded hesitantly, her wide tear-filled eyes darting around the room as if searching for reassurance. "Good girl," Alex said softly. "He did the right thing." Maya sniffled, her small frame trembling. "Will he be okay?" she asked, her voice barely audible. "The doctors will do everything they can to help him," Alex promised, though his mind churned with unease. He crouched beside Maya, meeting her gaze. "Did you see the people who were yelling?" Maya froze for a moment, then shook her head. "I just heard them," she murmured, clutching her stuffed rabbit even tighter. "I didn't look. Grandpa told me to hide." The radio crackled on Alex's hip, making Maya jump. Unseen paramedics reported, 1 unconscious female, approximately late 60s, significant bruising, possible head trauma, signs of a struggle, overturned furniture, broken glass, transporting now. Alex's breath caught in his throat. "Copy that. Prepare trauma room 3 for arrival," he said into the radio before turning back to Maya. "Your grandpa's on his way here. Maya, the doctors are ready to take care of him. You're safe now and we'll figure this out together." Maya nodded, but her face crumpled as fresh tears spilled over her cheeks. "She didn't wake up," she said, her voice breaking. "I tried and tried." Alex pulled a blanket from a nearby supply cart, draping it over Maya's small shoulders. "I know it's scary," he said, "but you're not alone. I'll be right here with you." Minutes later, the ER doors burst open, and a stretcher was wheeled in, flanked by paramedics. Harold Whitman, her face pale and bruised, lay motionless under an oxygen mask. Alex glanced at Maya, who stiffened and stared at her grandfather's frail form. "She's in good hands now," Alex said, his voice calm but firm. He placed a hand on Maya's back, guiding her away from the chaos of the trauma team swarming Harold. "Let the doctors do their job. You've done so much to help her already," he assured her. Maya didn't respond, her tear-streaked face a mask of fear and guilt. Alex stayed by her side, offering quiet reassurance even as his own mind raced. Detective Daniel Blake arrived at the small suburban home, the wail of a siren fading into the distance as the patrol car pulled away. The house stood under the dim glow of a streetlight, its door ajar like a gaping wound on the modest single-story structure. Blake's sharp eyes scanned the exterior, neatly trimmed hedges, a mailbox with Harold Whitman engraved in neat letters, and a shattered living room window. Something was very wrong. Stepping cautiously over the threshold, Blake surveyed the scene. The entryway was littered with shards of glass and muddy footprints trailing from the broken window toward the back door, which was still swinging slightly on its hinges. Inside, the chaos told the story of a violent intrusion: furniture overturned, drawers yanked out, and papers scattered across the floor. A broken lamp lay in pieces near the sofa, its bulb crushed underfoot. Blake crouched to examine the footprints and pulled out his phone to snap a photo. The prints were uneven, with a slight drag to the right foot, suggesting one of the intruders had an injury or limp. "Detective, over here," an officer called from the dining room. Blake straightened and followed the voice, stepping carefully over the debris. In the dining room, an open china cabinet revealed its shelves were emptied, fine porcelain plates and heirloom glassware smashed on the ground. On the table sat an appended box of photographs and documents. Blake picked up a crumpled sheet, scanning its contents, a bill of sale for a property from years ago. The paper seemed unimportant, but its placement among the mess hinted at something deliberate. The intruders hadn't been looking for cash or valuables. They had been searching for something specific. Blake's phone buzzed in his pocket. He answered quickly. "Detective Blake speaking. Ethan Walker here, Detective. Harold is still unconscious, but I'm with Maya. The little girl is terrified. She mentioned hearing the men yelling at her grandfather." Blake stepped out of the dining room, lowering his voice. "Did she say anything about what they were after?" "Not exactly," Ethan replied, but he added, "She said her grandfather told her to hide under the table when the men came in. She overheard one of them saying, 'We don't have much time.'" Blake nodded, filing the information away. "Keep her safe, Ethan. I'll follow up as soon as I can." Ending the call, he re-entered the living room where another officer approached. "Detective, a neighbor is awake and says they saw something." Blake nodded. "Let's hear it." The officer led him outside, where an elderly man stood on the sidewalk, arms folded over his chest against the chill. "You're the detective?" the man asked, his voice gravelly. "That's right, Detective Daniel Blake. Can you tell me what you saw?" The man nodded, squinting as he spoke. "I was up late watching the news when I saw two men running out of Harold's house. They got into a black SUV, looked like one of those fancy ones, and sped off. Did you get a license plate?" Blake asked hopefully. The man shook his head. "Too dark and they were moving fast. But I did notice one of the men was limping, like he hurt his leg or something." Blake jotted down the details in his notebook. "That's helpful. Anything else?" "Just that they didn't seem like amateurs. They moved quick, like they knew what they were doing." Blake nodded in thanks, handing the man a card. "If you remember anything else, give me a call." Returning to the house, Blake joined the forensic team now combing the scene for those footprints. He directed, gesturing toward the muddy marks near the window. "Get me prints off any surfaces they might have touched." The forensic lead, a wiry woman with a no-nonsense demeanor named Jessica Torres, approached with an update. "Detective, we found fragments of a phone near the sofa. Looks like it was smashed deliberately. We'll try to recover the data." Blake's gut tightened. Whoever these men were, they'd come prepared. Smashing the phone likely meant Harold had tried to call for help. He turned back to the dining room, his eyes scanning the scattered papers. Whatever they were after. At the hospital, Ethan Clark sat beside Maya in a quiet corner of the waiting room, holding a warm cup of cocoa in his hands. Maya stared at the cup but didn't drink, her small body rigid with tension. "Do you think Grandpa will wake up soon?" Maya asked softly. Alex leaned closer, his voice soothing. "The doctors are doing everything they can to help him. He's very strong, Maya, just like you." Maya nodded, though her small face remained drawn with worry. "The men, they were mad at him." "What do you mean, sweetheart?" Alex asked gently, not wanting to push but needing to understand. "They kept yelling," Maya said, her voice trembling. "They said he should have told them where something was." Alex frowned, alarmed by the revelation but careful not to show it. Did they say what they were looking for? Maya shook her head, tears spilling down her cheeks. I don't know. Grandpa said to hide. I didn't look. Alex wrapped his arms around Maya, holding her tightly. You're so brave, Maya. I'm here, and I won't let anything happen to you. Detective Blake sat at his desk in the precinct, the dim glow of his computer screen casting long shadows on the walls. The scene at Harold Whitman's house replayed in his mind. The overturned furniture, the muddy footprints, the shattered lamp. It wasn't a random break-in. Whoever did this had a purpose and was willing to use violence to achieve it. He leaned forward, typing Harold's name into the department's database. The search returned a long list of documents, but one flagged file immediately caught his attention. Harold Whitman, Confidential Witness, Financial Crimes Division. Blake clicked on the file, his brow furrowing as he skimmed the contents. Harold had been the key whistleblower in an ongoing case against Victoria Callaway, a high-profile financier facing embezzlement charges. The accusations centered on Callaway's siphoning of millions from her investment firm, leaving countless clients defrauded. Harold, a former accountant at the firm, had discovered the irregularities and turned over crucial evidence to authorities. Callaway was notorious in financial and criminal circles, and the case had made headlines months ago. But it was far from over. Harold's testimony and the evidence she provided were set to dismantle Callaway's empire. Blake now suspected Callaway had made him a target. In the forensic lab, Detective Blake reviewed the latest updates from the crime scene on a large monitor. Images of partial fingerprints lifted from Harold's home flashed on the screen. Jason Torres, the lead forensic analyst, gestured at one match highlighted in green. "We got a hit," he said. Blake's voice was grim. "Fits the description of one of the intruders, Erica Reyes. She's been flagged in multiple investigations for extortion, intimidation, and assault." Jason nodded. "She's Callaway's muscle. If Reyes was at the scene, this wasn't a random robbery. They were looking for something specific." Blake leaned closer to the screen, studying Reyes' mugshot. The woman's face was hardened, her narrow eyes suggesting a mix of cunning and ruthlessness. "What about the other prints?" "None solid matches yet," Jason replied. "But we're still running them through the database. Enough to connect this to Callaway's operation." Blake's jaw tightened. The connection between Harold and Callaway wasn't just circumstantial, it was motive. Callaway had everything to lose if the embezzlement case proceeded, and Harold was a direct threat to her freedom. If Callaway was behind this retaliation, it wasn't just possible, it was inevitable. Back at the hospital, Harold remained unconscious, his frail body hooked to machines that monitored his vitals. In a nearby waiting room, Maya sat curled in a chair, her stuffed rabbit still clutched tightly in her arms. Nurse Sarah Morgan worked quietly at her station nearby, reviewing patient charts. It had been a long day, but she refused to let her guard down. The police presence outside the hospital offered some reassurance, but Sarah couldn't shake the uneasy feeling that something was about to happen. In the shadows outside, two men dressed in dark clothing exited a sleek black sedan, their faces obscured by caps pulled low over their brows. They moved with purpose, their steps measured as they approached a side entrance. "This has to be clean," the wiry man muttered. "No mistakes." Inside, Maya sat curled in a chair in a private waiting area, her stuffed rabbit clutched tightly to her chest. Her eyelids drooped, but sleep wouldn't come. The faint glow of the overhead lights made her feel small and exposed. Sarah had checked on her just moments ago, offering a soft smile and a warm blanket, but Maya couldn't shake the memory of the night her world had turned upside down. She glanced toward the hallway leading to her grandfather's room. The thought of Harold lying there alone filled her with unease. Quietly, Maya slipped off her chair and padded down the corridor, her small feet making almost no sound against the linoleum floor. In Harold's ward, the two men crept through the door, moving with eerie precision. The wiry man opened the duffel bag, pulling out a syringe filled with a clear liquid. "This ends tonight," he muttered, nodding towards Harold. The larger man stood by the door, keeping watch. "Hurry up," he hissed. "We're not alone here." As the wiry man approached Harold's bedside, Maya appeared in the doorway, her eyes widening in shock. For a split second, time seemed to freeze before Maya let out a piercing scream, her voice echoing down the sterile corridor. The larger man cursed under his breath. "We're blown. Let's go," he shouted, grabbing his partner by the arm and yanking him toward the exit. Sarah heard the scream and bolted from her station, adrenaline surging through her veins. She reached the ward just in time to see the two men slipping out the door. Her eyes darted to Maya, who stood frozen in place, tears streaming down her face. "Maya," Sarah cried, rushing to the child and pulling her into her arms. "It's okay, sweetheart. You're safe now." Maya clung to Sarah, sobbing. "They were going to hurt Grandpa," she wailed. Sarah's heart raced as she scanned the room, her gaze landing on Harold's still form. He appeared unharmed, but the sight of the syringe left on the bedside table made Sarah's stomach churn. She quickly pressed the emergency button on the wall, summoning security and medical staff. Within moments, the ward was filled with activity. Nurses checked Harold's vitals while security guards swept the area for any sign of the intruders. Detective Daniel Blake arrived at the hospital minutes later, his face grim. He listened intently as Sarah recounted what had happened, her jaw tightening with each detail. "We're professionals," Sarah said, her voice steady despite the lingering fear. "We moved fast and knew exactly what we were doing." "If Maya hadn't screamed," Blake said, placing a reassuring hand on Sarah's shoulder, "you did everything right." Maya's bravery might have saved Harold's life. Maya, still clutching her stuffed rabbit, peeked out from behind Sarah. "Are they going to come back?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. Blake crouched down to her level, his expression softening. "Not if I can help it," he said firmly. "We're going to make sure you and your grandpa are safe." Blake immediately coordinated with hospital security, doubling the number of officers stationed around Harold's room. He also arranged for plainclothes detectives to patrol the hospital, ensuring no one could slip through undetected. Detective Blake's team worked around the clock, analyzing the syringe left behind by the intruders. Officer Carlos Morales, his voice laced with anger, reported, "This is Callaway's work. She's trying to tie up loose ends." Blake nodded, his mind racing. The evidence against Callaway was mounting, but so was the danger. Harold's survival wasn't just a matter of justice. It was the only way to ensure Callaway faced the consequences of her actions. As the hospital quieted once more, Blake stood outside Harold's room, watching over Maya and Sarah as they sat together. The little girl had finally fallen asleep, her head resting against Sarah's shoulder. Blake's phone buzzed and he answered quickly. "It's Captain Andrews," he said. "I heard about the attack." "How's Whitman?" "She's stable," Blake replied, "but this was close. Too close. Callaway isn't letting up. We need to move faster." "And what's the status on the evidence from the safe?" "The tech team is still decrypting the files," Blake replied. "Once we have the full picture, we'll have everything we need to bring Callaway down." Blake glanced through the window at the unconscious woman. "She'll wake up." "She has too." Detective Daniel Blake leaned over a detailed map of the city sprawled across the precinct's operations table. He traced his finger over a series of industrial sites on the outskirts. His team gathered around him. The pressure to dismantle the Callaway syndicate had reached its peak, especially after the brazen hospital attack. They needed to strike hard and fast before Callaway could regroup. "Here's the plan," Blake began, his voice steady but urgent. "We leak false information through Reyes' phone, making it seem like we're transferring Harold's evidence to a secure federal facility." Officer Carlos Morales nodded, catching on. "And we make sure Callaway's men intercept that intel." Blake smirked. "Exactly. They'll think it's their last chance to destroy the evidence. When they come for it, we'll be ready." The fake transfer was meticulously staged. A convoy of unmarked vehicles flanked by police escorts departed the precinct with an empty evidence box. The convoy's route was intentionally erratic, weaving through the city to make it appear genuine. At each checkpoint, updates were deliberately leaked, ensuring Callaway's men could follow the breadcrumbs. Meanwhile, Blake's tactical team positioned themselves at the final destination, an abandoned warehouse in the industrial district. It was a sprawling, desolate site, perfect for an ambush. Officers in plain clothes mingled nearby, posing as workers or loiterers, their weapons concealed but ready. As night fell, a convoy of black SUVs crept toward the warehouse. Dominique Dom Reyes' enforcer sat in the lead vehicle, her sharp eyes scanning for any sign of a setup. "This better not be a trap," she growled into her earpiece. "Keep your eyes open." The SUVs came to a stop near the warehouse's loading dock. Dom stepped out, flanked by a handful of armed women. Their movements were tense and deliberate as they approached the warehouse, finding the convoy vehicles parked inside, seemingly unguarded. "There it is," Dom muttered, spotting the evidence box resting on a table. She gestured to one of her women. "Check it." The woman hurried forward, prying open the box. It was empty. "It's a setup," she shouted. Just as floodlights blazed to life, illuminating the entire area, police ordered, "Drop your weapons." Blake's voice boomed through a megaphone. "Police! Drop your weapons and surrender." Dom snarled, raising her hands slightly but not letting go of her weapon. "You think you're smart, huh? This doesn't end with me." "Maybe not." Blake stepped forward, but Dom wasn't ready to surrender. With a sudden sharp movement, she raised her weapon, aiming for Blake. A sharp crack echoed through the warehouse as Morales fired, hitting Dom in the shoulder. She cried out, dropping her weapon and collapsing to her knees. "Secure her," Blake ordered, and officers swarmed Dom, cuffing her as she glared defiantly. With Dom in custody, the rest of Callaway's men were rounded up, and their vehicles searched for additional evidence. The sting operation had been a resounding success, dealing a critical blow to Callaway's network. Back at the precinct, Blake interrogated Dom, using the weight of her capture to press for information. At first, Dom remained tight-lipped, but the evidence against her was overwhelming. Faced with the inevitability of a long prison sentence, she finally broke. "Callaway knew Harold had dirt on her," Dom admitted. "I thought she kept it all at her house. When we couldn't find it, I panicked. The hospital hit, that was my last-ditch effort, and the rest of my operation?" Blake pressed, "Where's she hiding?" Dom hesitated, then said, "There's a safe house on the east side. She's probably there, trying to figure out her next move." As Blake's team pieced together the information from Dom and the evidence collected, it became clear that Callaway's empire was crumbling. The raid on the warehouse had not only captured key players but also uncovered additional leads, financial documents and burner phones that linked Callaway to a web of criminal activity. The documents from Harold's safe were the final nail in the coffin. Morales handed Blake a file. "We've got enough to charge Callaway with racketeering, extortion, and attempted murder." Blake nodded, his resolve firm. "Let's finish this." The safe house was a modest two-story building on the outskirts of town, surrounded by overgrown trees and a rusted chain-link fence. It was unassuming, the kind of place meant to blend in and avoid attention, but the police knew better. As the convoy of unmarked vehicles approached, officers moved swiftly into position. Blake led the charge, his gun drawn as he signaled for the team to breach the front door. "Go," he commanded, and the tactical team sprang into action. The door splintered under the force of the battering ram, and officers poured into the building. Inside, the scene was chaotic. Callaway's men scrambled, caught off guard by the sudden assault. One attempted to flee through a back window but was quickly intercepted by officers stationed outside. Blake moved with precision, clearing room after room until he reached the study. There, sitting behind a cluttered desk, was Victoria Callaway, the once composed and untouchable businesswoman now looking disheveled. Her expensive suit was wrinkled, and her eyes were bloodshot. Detective Blake Callaway drawled, attempting to maintain her arrogance. "I was wondering when you'd show up." Blake didn't flinch. "It's over, Callaway." Callaway smirked, leaning back in her chair. "You have no idea who you're messing with, detective." "Actually," Blake said, stepping closer, "I know exactly who you are, and I have everything I need to bury you." Callaway's bravado faltered as two officers flanked her, pulling her from her chair and cuffing her wrists. She struggled briefly but quickly realized resistance was futile. "You're making a mistake," Callaway hissed as she was led out of the room. Blake followed her expression coldly. "Oh, it's over, and you're going to spend a long time answering for what you've done." The team continued their sweep of the house, uncovering additional evidence, ledgers, burner phones, and encrypted files. It was enough to solidify the case against Callaway and dismantle her operation entirely. Back at the hospital, Nurse Sarah Morgan sat at Harold's bedside, her hand resting gently on the older woman's arm. Maya dozed in a nearby chair, her stuffed rabbit clutched tightly to her chest. The room was quiet, the only sound the soft beep of the heart monitor. Harold's eyes fluttered open, his gaze unfocused at first. Alex leaned in, his voice soft but urgent. "Harold, can you hear me?" Harold blinked slowly, focusing on Alex. "Where am I?" "You're at the hospital," Alex explained gently. "You've been unconscious, but you're safe now." Harold's eyes widened as memories flooded back. "Maya? Is she okay?" Alex nodded, his tone reassuring. "She's fine. She's right here and she's been so brave." Harold's shoulders sagged with relief, but the weight of everything he'd endured still lingered. "They came for me," he whispered. "They wanted the evidence." Detective Blake arrived at the hospital not long after, relieved to see Harold awake. He sat beside her, his tone serious but compassionate. "Mr. Whitman, we've arrested Callaway. We have evidence tying her to the attack on your home and the hospital incident, but your testimony will be the nail in the coffin." Harold hesitated, his hands trembling. "Testify? You want me to stand in court and face her?" "I know it's a lot to ask," Blake admitted, "but you're the key to taking her down. If we don't stop her now, she'll find a way to rebuild." Harold glanced at Maya, who had woken and was listening intently. The little girl's wide eyes were filled with hope and trust. Harold took a deep breath, steeling himself. "I do it, for Maya and for everyone else." "She's wrong." Blake nodded, a hint of admiration in his eyes. "You're doing the right thing. We'll make sure you're protected." As Callaway sat in a holding cell, her arrogance began to crumble. The evidence against her was overwhelming, and whispers among her men about defecting to save themselves only added to her downfall. Detective Blake left the precinct that night with a renewed sense of purpose. Harold's bravery and Maya's resilience reminded him why he fought so hard for justice. They weren't just names in a case file. They were people whose lives had been torn apart and deserved to be made whole again. The courtroom buzzed with quiet tension as the trial of Victoria Callaway began. Journalists filled the gallery, their notepads and cameras ready to capture every moment of the high-profile case. The public had followed the story with fascination, and now all eyes were on the brave whistleblower and the detective who had unraveled the web of corruption. Harold Whitman sat at the prosecution's table, his hands clasped tightly in his lap. Though his face still bore faint traces of the ordeal, his demeanor was resolute. Across the aisle, Callaway sat with her legal team, her expression cold and calculating. Even in the face of overwhelming evidence, her arrogance had not wavered. Detective Daniel Blake sat nearby, reviewing his notes. He caught Harold's eye and gave him a small nod of encouragement. Harold returned the gesture, a quiet exchange of determination between two people who had fought tirelessly for this moment. The prosecutor, a sharp-witted woman named Evelyn Monroe, wasted no time presenting the case. She began by detailing the series of events leading to Callaway's arrest, emphasizing Harold's courage in exposing her fraudulent activities. The recovered documents were introduced as evidence, their contents projected on a large screen for the jury to see. "These records," Monroe stated, "show not only the extent of Victoria Callaway's embezzlement but also her direct involvement in orchestrating violent attacks to silence those who dared to oppose her." Harold was the first to take the stand. He recounted his discovery of the fraudulent activities within Callaway's company and his decision to come forward despite knowing the risks. His voice wavered slightly as he described the night of the attack, but he held his composure, his resolve shining through. "When they broke into my house," Harold said, his gaze steady on the jury, "they weren't just looking to scare me. They were looking for the evidence I'd kept hidden. They were willing to destroy everything to protect themselves, even if it meant getting rid of me." Callaway's defense attorney attempted to rattle him during cross-examination, suggesting his actions were driven by personal vendetta. Harold's response was calm but firm. "This was never about revenge," he said. "It was about doing what's right." Next, Detective Blake took the stand. His testimony painted a vivid picture of the investigation, from the initial break-in to the sting operation that led to Callaway's arrest. He described the lengths Callaway's men had gone to silence Harold and destroy the evidence, leaving no doubt about their intentions. The defense tried to undermine Blake's credibility, questioning the tactics used during the investigation. Blake remained unshaken, his responses measured and precise. "Our methods were by the book," he stated, "and the evidence speaks for itself." Callaway orchestrated these attacks, and her men carried them out. The courtroom grew even more tense when Mia Reyes, Callaway's enforcer, was brought in to testify. Shackled and flanked by guards, Mia cut an imposing figure, but her demeanor was subdued as part of a plea deal. She had agreed to testify against Callaway in exchange for leniency. Mia's testimony was damning. She detailed the orders she had received from Callaway, including the directive to break into Harold's home and later to stage the hospital attack. Callaway wanted everything tied up, Mia admitted. Harold and that evidence were the only things standing in her way. The defense attempted to discredit Mia, highlighting her criminal history and suggesting she was lying to save herself. Mia shrugged her expression bitterly. "Believe what you want. I'm already paying for what I've done." But Callaway, she's the real monster. As the trial progressed, the weight of the evidence became impossible to ignore. Callaway's defense team fought hard, but their arguments crumbled under the mountain of documentation, testimonies, and forensic evidence. When the jury retired to deliberate, the courtroom fell into a hushed silence. Hours felt like days as everyone waited for the verdict. Finally, the jury returned, their expressions solemn but resolute. The foreperson stood, clearing her throat. "We find the defendant, Victoria Callaway, guilty on all counts." A collective sigh of relief swept through the room. Callaway's stoic mask slipped for the first time, a flicker of fear crossing her face as the judge handed down the sentence: 20 years in federal prison without the possibility of parole. The courtroom erupted in murmurs, reporters scrambling to capture the historic moment. The prosecution ensured that Callaway's entire operation was dismantled. 2 of her hired hitmen, who attempted to kill Harold in the hospital, were also charged and convicted with attempted murder and conspiracy. Several of Mia's men apprehended during the warehouse raid faced charges ranging from accessory to kidnapping and assault. Mia, while cooperating with the authorities, did not escape unscathed. She was sentenced to 12 years in prison for her direct involvement in the attacks, though her plea deal spared her from harsher penalties. With Callaway's conviction and the dismantling of her syndicate, the Whitmans were finally free from fear. Harold decided to move to a quieter town far from the chaos and memories of the ordeal. A local charity helped furnish a new home, and for the first time in months, Harold felt hope blossom in his heart. Maya too seemed to thrive. She made friends at her new school and developed a love for reading, something Alex had encouraged during their long hours at the hospital. On the day they moved to their new home, Blake made one last visit. Standing outside the truck filled with their few belongings, he extended his hand to Harold. "This isn't goodbye," he said with a smile. "If you ever need anything, you know where to find me." Harold clasped his hand. "Thank you, Detective, for everything." Maya ran up, throwing her arms around him. "Bye, Detective Blake. Don't forget us." Blake knelt, patting the girl's shoulder. "Not a chance, kiddo. You take care of your grandpa, okay?" Maya nodded fiercely. "I will." As the moving truck pulled away, Blake stood by his car, watching until it disappeared down the road. He drove through their new town a few weeks later, his work bringing him nearby. Passing by their home, he spotted Maya in the yard, her laughter ringing out as she played with the puppy. Harold waved from the porch, looking more relaxed than he'd ever seen him. Blake smiled to himself, a sense of peace settling over him. The case was closed. Justice had been served, and the Whitmans were starting anew. He drove off, reflecting on the journey. Sometimes, it wasn't the big victories that mattered most. It was the small human moments. A little girl's laugh, a grandfather's gratitude, and the knowledge that doing the right thing could change lives. Thanks for watching till the end. If you enjoyed the story, give this video a like if you haven't already and subscribe for more.